great deal of the human brain is dedicated to vision processing. Estimates are that as much as 2/3 of it is, but those estimates may be high because so much of what's going on with visual processing in the human brain also involves other functions, motor functions particularly. I'll demonstrate, but most of you have done this. I wasn't even looking at it. There's no getting away from the fact that vision processing is something that's not only cognitively natural for us, but that it's also natural for us to integrate what we see with the tasks we undertake, how we maneuver around in the world, and also that it's natural to integrate what we see with what comes through the other senses. The result is that seeing is so incredibly easy for us. And this is because our brains develop so that we can cognize what we see automatically. If we find something easy to do, this is a general fact, if we find something easy to do, that's because our brains evolved over eons to do exactly that. So our brains evolved to effortlessly cognize what we see, but that doesn't mean a brain can do that under all circumstances. There are cases of people who have been blind from birth, or nearly so, and then they get their vision back surgically as adults. The shocker, no one saw this coming, is that they found seeing irksome. One person tried it for several months and then gave up on it, started wearing black glasses so she wouldn't see anything. It's very common. It's easy, and I'm going to switch to something else that's also easy for us to do because we evolved to do it. It's easy to count objects if there are 1, 2, or 3 of them. Actually, it's easy to just recognize that there are 1, 2, or 3 objects in front of you. Babies can do it, almost newborn babies. Animals can do it. And that's because our brains evolved to do this. There's parts of the brain that are dedicated to doing exactly this. Then things get harder. Counting more items, multiplying, dividing. By the time we get to dividing, we're doing something that the brain finds pretty unnatural, pretty hard. Our brains haven't evolved to manage the task of dividing. So we have to dedicate parts of it that normally do something else to dividing. And that's why dividing is hard. And it gets worse, harder, with higher mathematics. Another rule of thumb, if a cognitive task is hard, it's hard because the brain didn't evolve to manage that task. So I don't want to talk to you today about cognitive processing and the evolution of the brain, at least not primarily. I want to talk about aesthetics and the vanishing of a cultural institution, the vanishing of literature and reading. I'm smiling as I say this, but of course this is a very sad fact. We all know reading is declining, certainly in the United States, but it's happening elsewhere as well. Europe, for example. Literature used to be central to culture as little as 30 years ago. Poetry, in fact, was central to culture, all cultures, for thousands of years. So I want to explain why that's changed for literature, why literature is dying. Because, generally speaking, it's a really big deal when a cultural institution dies. Cultural institutions don't die all that often, or they didn't used to. They usually lasted for centuries. And when they died in the past, they died slowly and agonizingly. Think of a monarchy. I mean the institution. I don't mean the French monarchy, for example, which died quickly. Or slavery. Everyone is talking about the fact that nowadays things are changing faster than they've ever changed before. In medicine, in computers and robotics, for examples, just a couple at random. But perhaps not everyone realizes that cultural institutions are dying too. Today, I mean, and that they're dying fast. Literature is the example I want to focus on. There are other examples, but I'm not going to talk about them today. It's easy to say, Why literature is dying, in one sense. We don't read that much anymore. We watch most of the time. That's obvious. If you get together with friends, so everyone's had this experience, you talk about the media that you've engaged with. Once upon a time, it was books. Occasionally, it's still a book. But it's mostly visual media. And that's because when we relax, we watch a video or a movie or a television show instead. Kids read when they have to because of school assignments. But the rest of the time, they're on social media as much as 8 hours a day, apparently. You might say, but wait, social media involves lots of reading. We read emails, tweets, we read news bites on the internet, and then there's all that advertising everywhere you look, not in here, but, oh, well, okay. On subway entrances, in subways, on buildings, not to mention street signs, in the air. Aren't we reading all the time? Well, yeah, I guess. But everyone's talking about this too, the decline of our ability to concentrate, collectively, I mean, that we can barely manage 7 minutes at a time. And maybe that's because after 7 minutes of television, there's invariably a 3-minute commercial break. This means that we can barely focus on a sustained task, any sustained task. That ADD is a syndrome, isn't a syndrome that some people have, that it's a new cultural development. So, here's a book. Okay? This is a great novel by William Gaddis, Jr. It's probably, now I'm going to make a little speech, it's probably one of the greatest American novels of the late 20th century. And it's pretty much inaccessible to everyone alive today. It's a black box. And I mean by that, only a handful of people alive today can read this and understand what's going on in it. Actually, Gaddis's Jr. is worse, I mean this, than special relativity. Special relativity, right, is easier for an untrained person to acquire an understanding of than this novel, Jr. And I mean it. Special relativity requires a good course in linear algebra, including inner product spaces, and a little calculus. That's it. About a year of hard work if you've got the right high school mathematics. Jr. will take the untrained person years to understand. Why? Not just because it's over 700 pages, although that helps. Not just because it requires sustained bouts of reading and sustained retention of what's in it, although that helps too. Not just because its content is complex and elusive. Not just because its prose is inventive. It's all dialogue, but clever, sound-sensitive dialogue. Primarily, the reason is because no one can read writing of this sort any longer. Seeing is a natural activity. That's why movies and television and videos, even though they're so recent as media, as art forms, are nevertheless so comfortable and easy to process. We just do what we do normally. We watch it. Reading is an extremely artificial activity. That's why it takes us years to learn to do it. That's why we all do it differently. Some of us subvocalize, some of us don't. We do it at different speeds. We all react to different patterns on the page differently. If it's handwritten, if it's got paragraphs, if the paragraphs have spacing of a certain sort, right? We all react to prose styles very differently. This is largely because we all read in different ways. Our brains all do it differently. Even if we were taught to read at the same time in the same classroom. And that's what happens when brains take on tasks that they didn't evolve to handle. They all handle it differently, and they all pretty much find it hard. So we're much more similar when it comes to watching the world around us. We evolved to see things, classify them rapidly, and we evolved to react to those things with understanding. So we process visual scenes almost immediately and with very little fatigue. We orient towards flicker. Flicker in the brush meant a predator might be there. We evolved to react that way. Visual media, television, movies, digital film, they rely on our natural cognitive tendencies. Reading, by contrast, requires tons of practice. Practice that no one engages in anymore. We don't have to practice seeing, so we don't have to practice seeing movies either. A film might look dated, but that's not because we're having trouble seeing it. A book that's dated becomes progressively harder to read, literally. Because reading is a cognitively artificial task, to learn to read one kind of thing isn't to learn to read another kind of thing. If you read law briefs all day long, that won't help you read short stories. Reading tweets won't help you to read other, even short things, poems or stories. Seeing is topic general. We don't need to learn how to see a new kind of object. But each new kind of prose, each new kind of prose trick, footnotes, parentheses, paragraph spacing, quote marks, dashes, makes new demands on readers that are hard for them to manage, that they have to learn to manage. I was told that this was the sweet spot for me to stand, and I haven't been here at all. I totally apologize to future viewers. You guys are okay. Oh well, I'm going to stand here now. See? Seeing can do that for you. Creative writing is hard to invent, but it's just as hard to read. Each invention of a new kind of writing requires learning to read it in a new way. Once upon a time, readers were capable of this. In the United States, literate readers were capable of this at least until around 1980. Because reading is so cognitively unnatural, it doesn't engage most of us emotionally the way seeing does. Seeing is visceral. We all know that. It grabs us in a way that reading just can't. We flinch reflexively when we see horror. We can react to horror on the page, but only if we engage our own imagination. And pornography is similar. Reading doesn't replace seeing it. It just doesn't. Okay, so it's easy to see why, once visual competition becomes ubiquitous enough, reading hasn't a chance. It's not a highbrow, lowbrow thing. It's that if you're tired and you want to relax, relaxing with a good book is just not as relaxing as watching a movie or a short documentary or a TED Talk. You don't do as much. You don't even burn as many calories. Watching me here is just easier than reading anything I've ever written, even the short things. Literature had an artificial monopoly on culture for a few thousand years. So it's funny to say that the centrality of literature to our entire previous history was a temporary artifact of circumstances, but it's true. Literature for a while was the only source of certain kinds of information about the world. Our history, science, guides for right and wrong, knowledge of anything outside a person's small locale, their town, right? The storytelling of anyone who wasn't alive any longer. Reading was what priests and kings did. The privileged, parchments and then books were valuables. Literature and poetry had very few competitors, even for sheer entertainment. The Romans, for example, could have a slave read to them, or they could watch animals and people being slaughtered. I exaggerate, but less than you think. That monopoly is gone. There's too much out there that's competing with reading. Reading as a form of entertainment anyway. Reading with some learning. Entertainment with some depth. We'll still read when we have to, or maybe we'll have robots read to us, actually. Social domestic robots who read to us are closer to reality than people realize. 5 years away. I kid you not. But literature as an institution needs more than that kind of reading to survive. The institution of literature will survive the way that institutions always survive after they've died. There'll be a small number of people practicing it nostalgically, the way classical music is performed these days and other dead art forms. For example, you'll have a little performance and someone will stand in front of you and read like I'm doing right now. Literature's role as the center of living culture is over because reading has been replaced by visual media. And if I had to provide a moment of death, but this is speculation, not that anything else I said was, I'd say 1980. Really. So before the web, in the United States anyway. A little later everywhere else, but not that much later. Okay, thank you.